Welcome to this talk on the games culture beyond the public schools from 1870 to 1914. As in earlier talks, the slides can be paused or moved manually. All schooling in the British Isles was independent of the state before the implementation of William Forster's Elementary Education Act in 1870. Free education for all children up to the age of 11 was introduced in 1891. In 1899, the school leaving age was raised to 12 years and then to 14 in 1918. Boys and girls at the public schools had their team games, but there was no sport for the children of the first elementary schools. Public school old boys took their love of games to their parishes and factories. These activities were more for the recreation of their parishioners and workers rather than for the education of their children. A second influence came through the Young Men's Christian Association, or YMCA, with its aim of Christian brotherhood. Octavia Hill and Lord Brabazon were two of many who endeavoured to provide gymnasia, playgrounds, parks and open spaces for working class children, while George Fletcher was one of a group of public school medical officers who sought to bring physical education into the curriculum of the public elementary school. By the 1890s, physical training and drill were being introduced under the assistance of Lord Meath's National Physical Recreation Society. Its members were appalled by the poor physical state of working class men, women and children, and by the high rejection rate of working class recruits for the army, and they sought to gain the benefits that Sweden and Germany had found from their state-sponsored gymnastic programs. By the turn of the century, the militarists were advocating the formation of cadet corps for working class children and drill classes in the elementary schools to complement the public school corps. The public schools were provided the officers. Now attention should be given to the other ranks. Even the youngest could play their part. In Veronica Vese's Tiny Verses for Tiny Workers of 1898, the girls had a scarf drill and the boys a gun drill, both with actions. The Boys' Brigade was founded by William Smith in 1883. Smith came from an army background, and as a young man in Glasgow, his main interests were the church, the YMCA, and the militia. The Boys' Brigade was based on the idea of using militia volunteer methods in Sunday schools, schools created by churches and chapels from the 1780s to provide education to working children on their one day of release from the factory, field or mine. Smith felt that these schools would be more exciting and thus more able to hold on to their boys if they instilled discipline and esprit de corps, but he had no plans for girls. What Thomas Arnold did for the public school boy, Smith would do for the working boy. He was certain that boys needed an association with its attendant teamwork and common interests, and that their pride in the association, or esprit de corps, should be shown in a distinctive uniform and a badge and in a creed. The brigade was restricted to boys over 12, whilst old boys were encouraged to return as leaders. Through activities such as drill with dummy rifles, physical exercises, team games and camping, Smith endeavoured to inculcate that esprit de corps which public school boys acquire as a matter of course. The Boys' Brigades did magnificent work throughout the country, and soon various offspring groups, all owing much to Smith's ideals, were founded. Many of the new brigades were associated with particular religious denominations: the Anglican Church Lads Brigade, the Catholic Boys Brigade, and the Jewish Lads Brigade. As the brigades expanded, so support came from figures as varied as the Archbishop of Canterbury and the military lords Methuen, Wolseley, Roberts and Kitchener. By the turn of the century, Methuen, wanting the brigades to be in step with the public schools, was advocating that the lads should be taught to shoot. Robert Baden-Powell's Boy Scouts movement was the most popular and most influential of the offspring of the Boys Brigade. Baden-Powell was a public school old boy, a dashing army officer, and through his exploits at Mafeking in the Boer War, a national hero. Educated at Charterhouse and then straight into the army, Baden-Powell possessed all the late Victorian public school attributes. He felt that he had gained nothing at all in the classroom, for he believed the main point in public school training is that it supplies common sense, manners and guts, even if it does not supply knowledge. Team games prepared the player for the greater game of life, and they promoted discipline and the obedience to rules and to the captain, to fair play, and to playing for one's side and not for personal glory. When he was serving in India in 1899, Baden-Powell wrote a small book, Aids to Scouting, for his fellow soldiers. Though the book is outwardly a military text, in effect it is bound up with the training of a scout's character. The good scout needed pluck, self-reliance, confidence and discretion. Baden-Powell pioneered straightforward, colloquial and readable writing for boys. The book was a folksy collection of yarns with much exotic vocabulary, posse, jamboree and the like. On his return to England after the Boer War, Baden-Powell found that his book was being used by various boys' groups, including the Boys Brigade, and that the editor of Boys of the Empire had serialized the contents under the heading Boy Scout. After examining Smith's work with the Boys Brigade, Baden-Powell decided to form his own movement. In 1907, the Boy Scouts were created. The first camp was held in 1907 on Brownsea Island in Poole Harbour. The party of 20 comprised 10 public school boys and 10 working class members of the Boys Brigade. This social mixing was important, for through his scouts, Baden-Powell hoped to break down class prejudice. The fundamental purpose of the Scouts was the character training of the nation's youth. Initially, only boys aged 11 to 15 could join. By 1916, younger boys aged 8 to 11 were admitted to the Wolf Cubs, and soon older boys were drawn in as rovers. The games mania of the public schools, in Baden-Powell's opinion, created a boyish, immature product, whereas he sought to fashion a more adult version. Boys, he argued, always aim to grow up. Only men hark back to childhood games. The emphasis in the Scouts would therefore be on adult, manly pursuits, and field sports were preferred to team games. The Boys Brigade was primarily a movement for the working classes, whereas the Boy Scouts had a wider appeal. Of the 14,000 Scouts enrolled in 1913, a large proportion was from the middle class, though not from the public schools, for they had their corps. And, importantly, many of the troops were attached to grammar schools. During the last quarter of the 19th century, and in the first years of the new one, increased attention was paid to the state secondary education program. The Scout troops attached to these schools did much to inculcate public school ideals. Many more aims and methods, practices and philosophies, principles and prejudice were adopted straight from the original models. The new grammar schools had a strong religious tone, with assemblies each morning instead of the public school chapel, and most of the headmasters were in holy orders. Many of the masters were public school old boys. A strong emphasis was placed on sixth form scholarship, and prefectorial systems were universally adopted. Almost all were wholly day schools, yet the boys were split into 4 to 6 houses, though the only expression of house feeling in most schools was limited to sporting competitions. Public school games and their attendant fashion accessories were taken on with enthusiasm. Rugby, football and cricket provided the staple diet. It certainly could not be the working class game of association football. Education for leadership became the aim of the schools, and soon the airs and graces of their second-hand public school image were firmly established. The public school sporting ethos gained even broader circulation in much of the popular literature of the period. In the 1880s and 1890s, there witnessed a flourish of historical adventure novels for boys, all plotting the exploits of their manly heroes. Then, the years after 1900 saw the heyday of the public school novel for men and the public school story for boys, each portraying the sporting ideal in action. Such literature not only broadened the horizons of the ideal, but also helped to sustain it. These tales of adventure and public school stories were avidly read by the very boys who would go to these schools at the age of 11 or 13. Thus, each new boy had a picture of the code of conduct he ought to employ before setting foot over the threshold. Of all the countless writers for boys of the late Victorian period, it is G.A. Henty who is the most popular and most widely read. Between 1868 and the turn of the century, Henty produced over 100 books at the rate of 3 a year. More than 150,000 copies of each book were sold, and serialization in journals broadened the market further. Henty prided himself on the historical accuracy of his books, and he added a sense of "I was there" reality to bring the stress of war right into the reader's home. Henty inserted heroic boys into a succession of true historical events. By this personalized approach, he persuaded young boys to identify with real adult heroes. Whether it was Clive in India, Wellington in the Peninsula, Roberts in Kandahar, or Buller in Natal, Henty was always able to take the boy reader right to the heart of the action. To aid the process, the hero was generally a fighting boy, very manly, full, as he termed it, of pluck. He had well-developed muscles and an eye for the main chance. He believed in fair play, but rarely displayed his feelings, and there was nothing namby-pamby about Henty's writings. He once ventured to allow a boy of 12 to kiss a girl of 11, but he received so many indignant letters that he never allowed the lapse to be repeated. Like Baden-Powell, Henty believed that a boy's one aim is to become a man and read what men do and have done. His manly novels sought to teach the English boy to glow at the thought of his ancestors' glories and to dream of adding to them. In the wake of Henty's success, he sold 25 million copies between 1868 and 1902. The late Victorian years saw a spate of nationalistic boys' journals hitting the newsagents and the railway station bookstalls. Each had a manly title: Pluck, Captain, Vanguard, and more, and all were full of tales in the style of the master. The stories abound in racial stereotypes, with the English always uppermost. The Russians are treacherous and loutish, the Spaniards are cruel, the Chinese are wily, and dark skins can only be savages. Literature from a higher plane was presented to boys in a similar manner, and became an essential disciplinary aspect of the imperial project. In 1891, the poet William Henley compiled a fighting book of verse for boys. Henley held the view that working-class young men of the period did not match their fathers in terms of patriotism and courage. Public school boys learned of self-sacrifice in the nation's cause from their studies of the classics and in their games. Boys at the elementary schools needed something similar. These Lyra Heroica, Tennyson's The Heavy Brigade, Corey's The Two Captains, Kipling's The English Flag, Austen's Is Life Worth Living, and a host more, proved immensely popular and were still being given as school prizes 30 years later. The successors to Henty's tales of adventure and excitement in the new century, with manly heroes who always started the day with a cold bath, came from the pens of Captain F.S. Brereton, Herbert Strang, Percy Westerman, E.W. Hornung, Arthur Conan Doyle, and above all, John Buchan. Buchan wrote his first tale of manly exploits in 1910, at a time when he was appalled by the dullness of most boys' books. He thought he could do something better. The result was Prester John. It tells the story of a young Scotsman, David Crawford, and his adventures in South Africa at the time of the Zulu uprising. In quick succession, other adventure stories followed, including the famed Richard Hannay series, notably The 39 Steps. All his books sold widely, and from them the boys at school in the years before the Great War gained some insight into a purer ideal of sportsmanship. The hugely popular boys' magazines that flourished in the years either side of 1900, with sales totaling 1 million a week, not only carried tales of adventure, but, as a regular ingredient, also contained accounts of public school life. Both genres were filled with rousing plots, an imperial outlook, and character training, and little religion or virtue. Talbot Baines Reed, the king of boys' own paper writers, penned their first school tale in 1879, but it was not until the turn of the century that every issue of the magazine had to contain such a story to satisfy its readership. The formula for these tales was standard, almost Tom Brown school days, but without the seriousness and idealism. Manliness for the masses was equated with patriotism, sturdiness, steadfastness, and sound common sense. The readers of Boys' Own Paper were to be trained to follow their public school leaders, and so would not need the higher qualities of the elite model. The picture they portray of public school life was remarkably realistic, especially when few of the writers had attended these schools themselves. Countless longer public school stories were published in book form, often for only a few pence. The advertisement for Walter C. Rhodes' Our Fellow at St. Mark's is typical. Stories of public school life were not reserved for boys alone. The 1899 publication of Kipling's Stalky & Co. released a barrage of public school novels for adult readers. They were avidly read, especially in the Edwardian years. The novels have a basic formula not too different from that of the tales for younger readers. The new boy enters the school with a mixture of fearful apprehension and determined ambition. He has usually read about Tom Brown. At first he suffers from loneliness and the rigours of fagging. Then comes the regimentation of games and the harshness of masters. He makes a few friends as he moves up the school, and he becomes free, mischievous, and leads a rebellious life. Eventually he learns true manliness, becomes a loyal prefect, and helps put down bullying, the excesses of athleticism, or both. Finally, as he leaves the school with regret, he is soundly placed on the path of a successful life. Most of the novels owed their lineage to Tom Brown. It is the school that plays the role of alchemist, transmuting the base metal of childhood into the purity of manhood. Lionel Portman's Hugh Rendell was set at Wellington. It pictured a school seeking aristocratic favours, bursting with manly games, with squash rackets seen as soft and effeminate, and striving for esprit de corps. Portman supported the athletic ideal of manliness so that boys might absorb some of the indefinable elements that constitute an English gentleman. A Day at Dulwich was one of several novels on the school written by A.H. Gilkes, at that time its headmaster. The hero is a manly boy, and the role of the school is the inculcation of sportsmanship. This, then, was the vein of the Edwardian public school novel, and it was not until the liberal attacks on the schools after the Great War that the tone changed. For the present, the athletic, imperialist, public school ideal was secure, whether you attended an elementary school or Eton. It could rule an empire. Thank you for listening.